It's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works available in Korean and in English translations. And joining us in the studio this week, we have with us cultural essayist Colin Marshall, host of the podcast Korean 한국 and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. He's here with us in the studio. Colin, hello. It's great to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So now this week is the last of our series celebrating Han Kang's Nobel Prize in Literature. Now over the last 2 weeks we've looked at Greek lessons and her arguably most famous book, The Vegetarian. We have reviewed one of her other works in the past as well, Human Acts, another very notable work of hers. But this week, Colin, I understand that you've brought her slimmest volume in translation yet.
Yes, it's quite an easy read in the sense that it doesn't take long to get through, but perhaps not such an easy read in other respects. It was published in Deborah Smith's English translation in 2017 as The White Book. And this is what Anders Olsen, the chair of the Swedish Academy's Nobel Committee for Literature, had to say about the book when Han Kang was awarded the prize.
In The White Book from 2016, Han Kang's poetic style once again dominates. The book is an elegy dedicated to the person who could have been the self's elder sister, but who passed away only a couple of hours after birth. In a sequence of short notes, all concerning white objects, it is through this whiteness that the work as a whole is associatively constructed. This makes it less a novel and more a kind of secular prayer book, as it has also been described. It is in addressing the dead that the novel reaches its final words. Within that white, all of those white things, I will breathe in the last breath you released.
Here in Korea, it came out the year before it came out in English under the title Hin, which, however simple it may sound, presents some linguistic difficulty of its own. It doesn't mean the white book, of course, and in fact, it doesn't even mean white, as in the name of the color, but rather white in its specifically adjectival form. Unlike the English word white, the Korean word hin looks strange all by itself, without any following noun to modify, although that does foreshadow the way certain of the book's very brief chapters, end with a similarly incomplete abruptness, sometimes even in mid-sentence.
Okay, so that sounds all very intriguing. Anyone who knows Han's works, though, will assume that such unconventional textual choices perhaps reflect deeper themes. The fact that this book, whose chapters, sentences, and even the title perhaps come to an abrupt end before we expect them to, does that give us a clue about the theme of the book, about the idea of existence being cut off prematurely?
I think it does give us a clear idea, and the clearest manifestation of that theme is one mentioned by Anders Olsen. The narrator returns over and over again to what we can't exactly call her memory of her older sister, who died just an hour after she was born. She relates her mother's harrowing experience of delivering the baby at home alone in the countryside, far from any hospital, and of her father's experience, presumably not much easier, of burying the infant on a mountainside. The girl's baby gown became a shroud, Han Kang writes in Smith's translation, referring to just one of the many white things and white phenomena that comprise the list by which the book is organized.
So then, can we perhaps interpret the title, The White Book, then as meaning, not that the book itself is white, of course, but that it's a book about the concept of white, I guess?
There's a lot of white space in the book. It's elegantly organized over many more pages than at first it seems it needs, but it makes an impact with its visuals. But readers familiar with the English language, the world of English language literature, may find themselves reminded of a book called Bluets by the American writer Maggie Nelson, which is similarly short and also difficult to categorize, but preoccupied with a different color, not white, of course, but blue. Now, we may not give it much thought, but we do invoke the color blue with some frequency in the English language, and we have more than a few expressions involving it: feeling blue, out of the blue, blue in the face, once in a blue moon, and so on. Even in translation, the White Book conveys something of the same relationship between the Korean language and the color white. In one section, Han Kang writes about the expression laughing whitely, or hayake utki, which denotes a kind of, and I quote, laughter that is faint, cheerless, its cleanness easily shattered. She describes it as an expression that, probably, in parentheses, exists only in her mother tongue.
Indeed, it's one of those Korean expressions that does not have a direct English language equivalent, which I imagine would always be difficult for translators when translating Korean literature. I know in some cases there might perhaps be an asterisk with a footnote, or they might try to expand on it in the actual prose, but that perhaps wouldn't have been so fitting with a book like this, right, which is deliberately sparse, I understand.
It's true, you don't want to harm the white space. And sometimes Deborah Smith actually makes the kind of translation choice here I personally like, which is simply to render a potentially tricky passage in English and leave the reader to figure out what's actually going on in it. One relatively long chapter of the White Book involves a white dog. The narrator, albeit narrating in the third person at this point, remembers being tied up in the yard of her parents' neighbor's house. The dog never barked at the sight of a stranger, just cowered in terrified silence, which reminded her of an old riddle. What's a dog that's a dog but doesn't bark? The lackluster answer to the riddle is fog, Han Kang writes. And so for her, the dog's name became Fog. That might at first sound like complete nonsense, even to a Korean speaker. But if you consider the Korean words for dog, ge, and fog, ange, it all starts coming together.
Right,
yes.
Okay, so it is a bit of a pun.
A bit of a pun, and it brings to mind an ancient Sumerian joke that made the rounds on the internet a few years ago, which also happens to be about a dog. It goes like this. A dog walked into a tavern and said, "I can't see a thing. I'll open this one." Our listeners will notice a certain lack of laughter in the studio. Even if the gag had Sumerians in stitches, we moderns will probably never be able to laugh at it.
I didn't even realize that was the end of the joke.
Yeah, that was the whole joke. We don't have the cultural context to understand it, so we can't even identify the joke. A pun about gay and unge, that hardly exudes comic genius, but it would be just as unintelligible to readers of the White Book unfamiliar with the Korean language. And the edition of the translation I read includes no explanatory material, but, as I say, footnotes, endnotes, to say nothing of parentheses, could have presented a problem in a text characterized by an elegance pared down enough to border on fragility.
Yes, it's a very interesting choice, and perhaps that style contributes to the difficulty you've mentioned of categorizing this book. It's been called a novel, but that may lead readers to expect more of a plot, which this rather lacks as well, right? We heard even the chair of the Nobel Committee for Literature say that it's a lesser novel and more a kind of secular prayer book. Right. So even if Han Kang's primary goal in the White Book isn't to tell a story, are all these meditations on various things united by any kind of narrative?
Well, unlike the Vegetarian and Human Acts, I should say, which are Han Kang's, of course, most widely known novels in English translation, the White Book doesn't take place in Korea. It opens with its narrator arriving in an apartment she's rented in a European city she never names, though much as the mother tongue to which she refers can only be Korean, the setting must be Warsaw. She writes that, and I quote, "Over a period of 6 months, starting in October 1944, 95% of the city was obliterated. This city, whose people rose up against the Nazis, from which the German soldiers were driven out in September 1944, and where a month of civilian government was achieved, hence Hitler's decision to use any means necessary to sweep it clean out of existence, as an example." A bit later in that same chapter, she writes, "In this city, there is nothing that has existed for more than 70 years. The fortresses of the old quarter, the splendid palace, the lakeside villa on the outskirts where royalty once summered, all are fakes. They are new things, painstakingly reconstructed based on photographs, pictures, maps. Where a pillar or perhaps the lower part of a wall happens to have survived, it has been incorporated into the new structure. The boundaries that separate old from new, the seams bearing witness to destruction, lie conspicuously exposed. Now, a city in which so much of the built environment has been destroyed and recreated, where neither the old things are as old as they seem, nor the new things as new as they seem. Where does this remind you of? Seoul may never have endured the near obliteration that Warsaw did, but for any reader who lives here, the relationship of this city's built environment to its own past will inevitably come to mind.
Indeed.
And for the narrator of the White Book, however, the destruction and rebuilding of Warsaw resonates on a more personal level. She thinks of, and I quote, "a person who had met the same fate as that city, who had at one time died or been destroyed. who had painstakingly rebuilt themselves on a foundation of fire-scoured ruins, who was therefore something new, who, some broken pediment having survived, has ended up bearing a strange pattern, the new distinct from the old. Now here she could mean herself, her older sister who lived only 1 hour, their mother, or some combination of the three, and that may explain the use of the word themselves in the translation. Somehow, the narrator has come to believe that her sister's death made her own life possible, even that, had her sister lived, she herself would never have been born. In some sense, she feels herself living, whether in Korea or in Europe, in Warsaw, in her sister's place.
Right, so there is quite a bit of poignancy then as well in this book. So the narrator seeing her sister's death in the city's destruction and her own life in its subsequent rebuilding after the war, you're saying then?
It's an analogy that'll certainly occur to some readers, although not every reader has accepted that specific interpretation. I think Han Kang, true to form, is a bit more difficult to pin down, especially in a book like this, though she hardly obscures the emotional experience at the core, which is that of being haunted by a sibling you could never have known, while temporarily inhabiting a replica, in effect, of a city in which you never could have lived. So anyone who, like the narrator of the White Book, has spent a long stretch of time alone in a foreign place can surely understand how that kind of setting, that kind of experience can suddenly send you to places within yourself, often places you haven't visited in a very long time indeed.
Well, it sounds like a very meditative book, should we say, one to take time over. And I guess that is one power of Han Kang's works, that they are certainly not fleeting, and that there's always much to unpack and consider. And that is, I think, something that readers should note, right, when approaching her works.
And they should note that they can read this book in half an hour, but they shouldn't read it in only half an hour. Take your time with this one. It's not long. You can afford to spend a couple hours with it to really get what she's going for, to at least give yourself the chance to have it come to mind and resonate with your own experiences and memories.
Right, and I think that's a good note to end on as well. I'm sure we'll be looking at more of her works in the future, not least one that has already been translated but not yet published, called We Do Not Part. That is set to come out next year, so we eagerly await that book. But today we're going to leave it there. We've been looking at The White Book by Han Kang today, and that concludes also our special Han Kang series. Colin, thank you for introducing us to another one of her works. It's been very enlightening, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you, Jung. See you next time.
And that's a wrap for today. We'll be back same time tomorrow, so we hope you join us again then. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.
KBS World Radio